My wife won $12 million in the lottery, and the first thing she did was kick me out of our house and call me a loser, but what her family heard in court 3 months later made them go completely silent. I'm Robert. I'm 38 years old, and I thought I knew the woman I married. But money has this way of showing you who people really are, and let me tell you, what I saw made me sick to my stomach. We've been married for 8 years, and yeah, it wasn't perfect, but it was ours, you know? I worked as a construction manager, pulled in around $72,000 a year, paid our bills, kept food on the table, nothing fancy, but we were stable. My wife Victoria came from money, like serious money. Her dad owned a chain of car dealerships across 3 states, and from day one her family looked at me like I was something they scraped off their shoe. When we got engaged, her father sat me down in his office with this leather-bound prenup and basically told me I'd get nothing if we ever split, and I signed it because I loved her and figured we'd make it work. For 8 years I dealt with the snide comments at family dinners, the way her mom would ask when I'd get a real career, the way her sister would joke about Victoria marrying down. But I kept my mouth shut because that's what you do when you love someone, right? Then everything changed on a Tuesday night in October. Victoria had been playing the same lottery numbers for years, called them her lucky numbers, some combination of birthdays and anniversaries, and I'd always thought it was kind of sweet even though I knew the odds were basically zero. I came home from a job site around 7, covered in dust, and found her standing in our kitchen staring at her phone with this look on her face I'd never seen before. She won $12 million. The actual payout after taxes came to $8.1 million. And in that moment when she told me, I grabbed her and we jumped around our kitchen like idiots, and for maybe 10 minutes I thought our lives were about to get better. I was so stupidly wrong. Her family showed up within an hour. I have no idea how they found out so fast. And suddenly our house was full of champagne bottles and people hugging Victoria while barely acknowledging I existed. Her father kept pulling her into corners for private conversations. Her mother was already on the phone with financial advisors, and her sister kept giving me these weird looks like I was a rat who'd snuck into the celebration. The energy shifted so fast it gave me whiplash. Victoria started acting different almost immediately. She'd go quiet when I walked into rooms. She'd whisper with her mom and stop when I got close. And when I tried to talk to her about plans for the money, she'd just say, "We'll figure it out," and change the subject. 3 days after the win, her father showed up at our house with a lawyer, not their family lawyer, but some shark in a $1,500 suit who specialized in asset protection. They sat at our dining table and explained to me very carefully that the lottery ticket was purchased with Victoria's personal allowance, that the prenup I'd signed covered all assets acquired during marriage through individual means, and that legally I had no claim to a single cent. Her father looked me dead in the eye and said, "You've been taken care of for 8 years, Robert. I think that's more than fair, don't you?" The way he said it made me feel about 2 inches tall. I looked at Victoria expecting her to say something, to stand up for me, to remind them we were married and in this together, but she just sat there examining her nails. That night she told me she thought we should take some time apart, said she needed space to think about her future, and the way she said her future, like I wasn't part of it anymore, made my blood run cold. I asked her what the hell was happening, and she finally looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before, like I was a stranger, like I was nothing. She said, "I need to figure out what I want, and honestly, Robert, I don't think I want this anymore." I asked what this meant, and she said, "This life, this house, this you." Her voice was so cold it could have frozen water. The next morning her father, her mother, and her sister showed up again, and this time they weren't pretending to be polite. Her father told me Victoria had decided to file for divorce, that I needed to pack my things and leave immediately, and when I said this was my home too, he actually laughed at me. Her mother said, "You've been living off our daughter's family for years. You should be grateful we're not asking for back rent." And her sister just smirked like this was the funniest thing she'd ever witnessed. Victoria stood behind them, and when I looked at her, desperately hoping she'd say this was all a mistake, she just shook her head and said, "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Robert, just go. You're embarrassing yourself." I'll never forget what she said next because it's burned into my brain forever. She looked at me with complete disgust and said, "I won $12 million and I'm not spending it on a loser like you. I could have done so much better, and now I finally can." Her family actually laughed. They laughed at me while I stood there in the house I'd helped pay for, in the life I'd helped build, and they treated me like garbage they were finally taking out. I packed 2 suitcases, grabbed my truck, and drove to a cheap motel off the highway that smelled like cigarette smoke and broken dreams. I sat on that scratchy comforter in a $45 a night room and felt like my entire life had just been ripped away from me by the people I trusted most. But here's the thing about hitting rock bottom. It gives you clarity, and sitting in that motel room, I realized something important. I wasn't going to just walk away. I pulled out my phone, found the business card for one of the best divorce attorneys in the state, a guy who'd handled some massive cases and had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless, and I called him right then at 9 o'clock at night. He answered, and when I told him my situation, he actually laughed and said, "Robert, I think you're going to like what I have to tell you." We met the next morning, and he spent 2 hours going through the prenup I'd signed 8 years ago, and then he looked up at me with this sharp smile and said the most beautiful words I'd ever heard. He said, "Your wife's family made a critical mistake. The prenup specifically states that lottery winnings obtained during the marriage are considered joint marital property. It's right here in Section 7. I almost fell out of my chair. He explained that whoever wrote the prenup probably copied it from a template and didn't think to modify that specific clause because what were the odds anyone would actually win the lottery, right? But they did. Victoria did. And according to the law and the document her own father had forced me to sign, I was entitled to 50% of every single dollar. The attorney leaned back in his chair and asked if I wanted to fight this, and I looked him dead in the eye and said, "I want everything I'm owed. I want them to know they can't just throw me away." He smiled and said, "Then let's go to war." I walked out of that office feeling something I hadn't felt in days. I felt powerful. I felt like maybe justice was actually possible, and I knew right then that Victoria and her family had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Within a week of hiring my attorney, Victoria's family went absolutely nuclear on me. And I mean, they pulled out every dirty trick in the book to try and bury me before we even got to court. Her father hired this attorney who had a reputation for destroying people in divorce cases. Guy's name was all over billboards downtown with slogans like "protecting what's yours," and the irony wasn't lost on me considering they were trying to take what was legally mine. The first letter I got from their lawyer was 12 pages long and basically called me every name you could think of without actually using curse words. Said I was a gold digger. Said I'd manipulated Victoria throughout our marriage. Said I'd contributed nothing to our household and was now trying to steal from a hard-working woman who'd finally caught a lucky break. Reading that letter made me so angry I had to put it down and walk around my motel room for 20 minutes just to calm down. My attorney told me not to worry, said angry letters meant they were scared, and scared people make mistakes. He was right about that. The first offer came 2 weeks later, $1.2 million for me to sign away all claims to the lottery winnings and disappear from Victoria's life forever. My attorney said it was an insult and we shouldn't even respond, but I told him to send back a counteroffer, 50% of $8.1 million, which came out to $4.05 million, and I wanted it in writing that they'd admit the money was marital property. They lost their minds. Victoria's father called my attorney directly and apparently screamed at him for 15 minutes about how I was a parasite trying to bleed his daughter dry. And my attorney just calmly repeated our position and hung up. The next offer came a week after that, $3.2 million, and they said it was their final offer and if I didn't take it they'd bury me in legal fees and drag this out for years. I said no. That's when things got really ugly. Victoria and her family started spending the lottery money like it was water, and this turned out to be the dumbest thing they could have possibly done. Within a month of winning, Victoria bought herself a brand new BMW for $87,000, put a deposit down on a penthouse apartment downtown for $250,000, and went on a shopping spree that included about $40,000 worth of designer clothes and jewelry. Her sister posted photos on social media of them at some resort in the Bahamas, and I could see Victoria in the background wearing what looked like a watch that probably cost more than my truck. My attorney was watching all of this like a hawk, and one day he called me into his office with this look on his face that I can only describe as pure joy. He explained something to me called commingling, which basically means mixing money together in a way that makes it legally impossible to separate. See, Victoria had deposited the entire lottery winnings into the checking account she'd been using throughout our marriage for groceries and household expenses, and then she started spending from that same account on all her new toys. He told me she'd just turned the entire $8.1 million into marital property because every lawyer in the state knows you don't mix funds like this, and she did it anyway. I asked him what that meant for our case, and the smile on his face told me everything I needed to know. We were about to win big. But wait, it gets even better. My attorney subpoenaed all of Victoria's financial records and discovered that her family's hotshot lawyer had made a catastrophic error in the paperwork they'd filed with the court back in November. In their response to our initial divorce filing, they'd included a line that said the BMW and the penthouse deposit had been purchased with marital funds, and this was signed under oath and submitted to a judge. My attorney showed me the document, and I swear I read that line 5 times before I understood what it meant. They'd admitted the lottery money was marital property in their own legal filing. He nodded with this huge smile and explained that they couldn't take it back now. Their own attorney had basically destroyed their entire case in one careless sentence. When my attorney sent them a copy of their own filing with that line highlighted, they went completely silent for 3 days. Then the panic offers started coming in. For $1 million. For $0.3 million. For $0.5 million with a gag order attached, so I couldn't talk to the media about the case. My attorney actually recommended I take the $4.5 million, said it was close enough to half and would save us the uncertainty of going to trial, but something in me just couldn't do it. This wasn't about the money anymore. I mean, yeah, the money mattered, but this was about the principle of the thing. This was about Victoria looking me in the eye and calling me a loser, about her family laughing at me while they threw me out of my own house. About 8 years of being treated like I wasn't good enough for their precious daughter. I looked at my attorney and told him we were going to trial because I wanted a judge to tell them exactly what they did wrong. He looked at me for a long moment, nodded, and said we'd finish this together. While we were preparing for trial, Victoria's family made one last desperate move that honestly just made them look worse. They hired a private investigator to follow me around and try to dig up dirt they could use against me in court. I noticed the guy after about 2 days. He wasn't very good at being subtle, and my attorney filed a motion to get the surveillance thrown out as harassment. The investigator apparently told their lawyer he'd found nothing. I went to work, went to the gym, went to my apartment, didn't date anyone or do anything remotely questionable, and their lawyer actually had to admit in a court filing that their investigation had turned up 0 evidence of wrongdoing. Then Victoria tried to claim I'd been emotionally abusive during our marriage, said I'd controlled her finances and isolated her from her friends, and my attorney just laughed when he read that because we had 8 years of bank statements showing she'd spent whatever she wanted whenever she wanted, plus about 50 character witnesses who could testify that I'd never stopped her from seeing anyone. The abuse allegations went nowhere. We were 2 weeks out from trial when their attorney called mine with one final settlement offer for $0.5 million. No gag order, no admission of guilt. Just take the money and let's end this. My attorney put him on speaker, and I looked right at that phone and said, "See you in court." You could hear the defeat in the other lawyer's voice when he acknowledged that he'd see us there. I spent those 2 weeks going over testimony with my attorney, practicing how to stay calm under cross-examination, reviewing every document we planned to submit as evidence. My attorney told me the judge we'd been assigned was tough but fair, didn't tolerate nonsense from either side, and had a reputation for following the law exactly as written. He assured me that if we presented our case cleanly and didn't get emotional, we'd win this thing. The night before trial, I barely slept, just lay in my apartment staring at the ceiling and thinking about how my entire life had come down to one day in a courtroom. But I wasn't scared anymore. I was ready. I was ready to look Victoria and her family in the eye and watch them realize they'd lost, and that feeling was worth more than any amount of money. The courthouse was packed on the morning of our trial, and I mean absolutely packed with people I'd never seen before, reporters with cameras, local news vans parked outside, and apparently our case had gotten enough attention that people were actually lining up to watch it unfold. My attorney told me this happens sometimes with lottery cases because everyone loves a good fight over money, but standing there in my only decent suit watching all these strangers file into the courtroom made me feel like I was about to be fed to lions. Victoria and her family arrived 20 minutes before we were supposed to start, and they looked like they were attending a movie premiere instead of a divorce trial. Her father wore a custom suit that probably cost more than 3 months of my salary. Her mother had on enough jewelry to fund a small country, and Victoria herself looked like she'd stepped off a magazine cover in some designer dress that probably had a price tag with 4 digits. They walked past me without even glancing in my direction, like I was furniture, like I was nothing, and I watched them settle into their seats with this air of absolute confidence that made my stomach turn. Her father was actually smiling and shaking hands with people like he was campaigning for office. Their attorney looked just as confident, had this swagger about him like he'd already won, and when the judge entered and we all stood up, I felt this moment of doubt creep in where I wondered if maybe I'd made a mistake by not taking their settlement offer. Then the judge sat down, looked out at the packed courtroom, and told everyone this was a legal proceeding, not a circus, and anyone who couldn't behave would be removed immediately. Her voice had this steel to it that made everyone sit up straighter, and suddenly I felt a little bit better. Their attorney went first and spent 45 minutes painting me as this manipulative gold digger who trapped poor innocent Victoria in a loveless marriage and was now trying to steal her lottery winnings after contributing nothing to the relationship for 8 years. He talked about how I'd signed a prenup acknowledging I had no claim to her separate property, how the lottery ticket was purchased with her personal money, how I was taking advantage of a legal technicality to rob a hard-working woman who'd finally gotten lucky. He made me sound like the worst human being on the planet, and I could see some people in the courtroom nodding along like they agreed with him. He kept emphasizing that Victoria had paid for everything in our marriage from her family money, that I'd been living off her generosity for years, and that now I was showing my true colors by demanding millions of dollars I hadn't earned. It was brutal to sit there and listen to someone describe me that way, but my attorney had prepared me for this, told me to stay calm and let them talk, because our evidence would speak for itself. When their attorney finally sat down looking very pleased with himself, my attorney stood up, and I swear the energy in that courtroom shifted immediately. He didn't yell, didn't get emotional, just laid out the facts in this calm, methodical way that made everything sound obvious and undeniable. He explained the prenup clause that specifically stated lottery winnings were joint marital property, showed the judge copies of the original document with that section highlighted, and pointed out that this wasn't some technicality, but the actual written agreement that Victoria's own father had insisted I sign. Then he moved on to the commingling issue, showed bank statements proving Victoria had deposited the lottery money into the checking account she'd used throughout our marriage for household expenses, showed receipts for all her purchases made from that same account, and explained that under state law this made the entire sum marital property regardless of how it was acquired. He presented the court filing from their own attorney that described purchases as being made with marital funds, pointed out that this was submitted under oath and signed by their legal team, and asked the judge how they could simultaneously claim the money was separate property while their own paperwork called it marital funds. The judge actually leaned forward at that point and looked at their attorney with this expression that made it clear she'd noticed the contradiction too. My attorney kept going, showed evidence of our 8 years together, bank statements proving I'd contributed to household expenses, testimony from co-workers and friends about our marriage, and systematically destroyed every claim their side had made about me being a freeloader. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. Victoria took the stand, and their attorney started asking her questions designed to make her look sympathetic. She talked about how hard our marriage had been, how I'd never supported her dreams, how she'd felt trapped and unhappy for years. She cried a little, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, and I could see some people in the courtroom looking at me like I was a monster. But then my attorney got his turn to question her, and that's when everything fell apart for them. He asked her about the bank account where she'd deposited the lottery money, and she admitted it was the same account we'd used for joint expenses throughout our marriage. He asked her why she didn't open a separate account for the lottery winnings if she believed they were her sole property, and she stammered something about not thinking it mattered. He showed her the receipts for the BMW and the penthouse and asked her to confirm these were purchased after she'd filed for divorce, and she had to admit they were. He asked her if anyone had forced her to make those purchases or if she'd chosen to do it on her own, and she said she'd chosen to. Then he asked her the question that I think sealed our victory. He asked her if she understood that by mixing the lottery money with marital funds, she was making it legally impossible to claim it was separate property, and she just sat there staring at him before finally admitting she hadn't thought about it that way. You could see the judge taking notes, could see the way she looked at Victoria with this expression that wasn't quite sympathy anymore, and I knew right then we had won. The closing arguments were almost anticlimactic after that. Their attorney tried to appeal to emotion and fairness. My attorney stuck to law and facts, and when the judge said she'd issue her ruling after a short recess, I actually felt calm for the first time in months. We waited in this little room off the courtroom for 90 minutes, and my attorney told me he felt good about our chances, but wouldn't make any promises. When we were called back in and the judge started reading her decision, I could feel my heart pounding so hard I thought everyone could hear it. She went through the prenup, confirmed that lottery winnings were explicitly included as marital property, discussed the commingling issue and how Victoria's actions had converted separate property into marital assets, and then she looked directly at Victoria and said the court found her claims of separate property to be without merit given the evidence presented. The judge ruled that I was entitled to 50% of the lottery winnings, which came to $4.05 million, and ordered Victoria to liquidate assets including the BMW and designer purchases to satisfy the judgment. The courtroom exploded with noise. Reporters were rushing out to file their stories. Victoria's family looked shell-shocked, and her father was red-faced and yelling something at their attorney while her mother just stared straight ahead in shock. Victoria herself was crying. Real crying this time, not the fake sympathy-seeking kind. And I almost felt bad for her until I remembered her calling me a loser and laughing while her family threw me out. My attorney shook my hand and told me we'd done it, and I just nodded because I couldn't quite process that it was really over. Outside the courthouse, there were reporters everywhere asking me questions, and I only answered one. Someone asked me how I felt about the verdict, and I looked right into the camera and said, "Justice always tastes good." That quote ended up in every news article about the case. The money came through about 6 weeks later after Victoria was forced to sell the BMW and return a bunch of the designer stuff she'd bought, and $4.05 million hit my bank account on a Tuesday morning in March. I sat in my apartment staring at the balance on my phone for probably 20 minutes, just making sure it was real. I didn't go crazy with it, didn't buy a mansion or a sports car or any of that stuff. I invested most of it, bought a small construction company that had been struggling and turned it into something profitable, and started building the life I'd always wanted but never thought I could afford. Last I heard, Victoria had moved back in with her parents and was working some office job, making about $42,000 a year, and her family never spoke to me again, which honestly was the best part of the whole deal. Sometimes I drive past the courthouse where it all went down and I think about that day, about how close I came to just walking away and accepting that I was worth nothing, and I'm so grateful I didn't. This whole thing taught me that standing up for yourself matters, that knowing your worth matters, and that sometimes the people who treat you like garbage end up getting exactly what they deserve. What do you think about this story? Let me know in the comments, drop a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories.